Hello, my name is Gary, and I was raised in the Western United States, so I'm a native English speaker. I hope that you will enjoy this YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.
Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, 1828 to 1905. Chapter 13. Passepartout gets more proof that luck favors the bold. The project was daring, filled with challenges, and possibly impossible. Mr. Fogg was willing to risk his life, or at least his freedom, on the success of his journey. However, he didn't hesitate and found an enthusiastic supporter in Sir Francis Cromarty. Passepartout was ready for anything. His master's idea thrilled him. He saw a heart and soul beneath Fogg's cold exterior and began to admire him. There was still the guide to consider. What would he do? Would he side with the Indians? If he wouldn't help, they needed to make sure he would stay neutral. Sir Francis asked the guide directly. "Officers," the guide replied, "I am a Parsee, and this woman is a Parsee. I will do as you command." "Excellent," said Mr. Fogg. But the guide continued, "If we are caught, we won't just risk our lives. We'll face horrible tortures." "We understand," replied Fogg. "We should wait until night to act." "I agree," said the guide. The kind Indian then shared some information about the victim. She was a famous beauty of the Parsee race, and the daughter of a wealthy merchant from Bombay. She had received a complete English education in the city, and her manners and intelligence made her seem European. Her name was Auda. Left an orphan, she was forced to marry an old Rajah of Bundelkund against her will. Knowing her dreadful fate, she tried to escape, but was caught again. The Parsee's story only strengthened Mr. Fogg and his companions' resolve to help. They decided that the guide should lead the elephant towards the pagoda of Pillaji, and they moved as quickly as possible. They stopped half an hour later in a grove about 500 feet from the pagoda, where they were well hidden, but could clearly hear the groans and cries of the fakirs. They then discussed how to reach the victim. The guide was familiar with the pagoda of Pillaji and knew the young woman was imprisoned inside. They debated whether they could enter through any of the doors while the Indians were in a drunken sleep, or if it was safer to make a hole in the walls. It was clear that the rescue had to happen that night. If they waited until dawn, when the victim would be led to her funeral pyre, no human intervention could save her. As soon as night fell, around 6 o'clock, they decided to scout around the pagoda. The cries of the fakirs were just stopping. The Indians were getting drunk on a mix of liquid opium and cannabis, so it might be possible to sneak past them to the temple. The Parsee, leading the others, quietly crept through the woods. After about 10 minutes, they reached the banks of a small stream. By the light of resin torches, they saw a pyre of wood with the preserved body of the Rajah on top, which was to be burned with his wife. The pagoda, with its towering structures rising above the trees in the deepening dusk, was 100 steps away. "Come on," whispered the guide. He moved even more cautiously through the brush, followed by his companions. The only sound was the low murmur of the wind in the branches. Soon the Parsee stopped at the edge of the clearing, which was lit by torches. The ground was covered with groups of Indians sprawled in their drunken sleep. In the background, among the trees, the pagoda of Pillaji stood out clearly. To the guide's disappointment, the Rajah's guards, illuminated by torches, were stationed at the doors and patrolling with drawn sabers. The priests were likely keeping watch inside as well. Realizing it was impossible to break into the temple, the Parsee decided not to advance any further and led his companions back. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty also understood that there was no chance of success from this direction. They stopped and had a quiet discussion. "It's only 8 o'clock," said the brigadier. "The guards might fall asleep eventually." "That's possible," replied the Parsee. They lay down at the base of a tree and waited. The wait felt long. The guide occasionally left them to check the edge of the woods, but the guards stayed alert, illuminated by the torches, and a faint light filtered through the pagoda's windows. They waited until midnight, but there was no change among the guards. and it became clear that they wouldn't be falling asleep anytime soon. The backup plan had to be put into action. They needed to create an opening in the pagoda's walls. They now needed to find out if the priests were guarding their prisoner as closely as the soldiers were guarding the doors. After a final discussion, the guide said he was ready to try, and they moved forward. They took a detour to approach the pagoda from the rear. By about 12:30, they reached the walls without encountering anyone. There were no guards, windows, or doors in sight. The night was dark. The moon, which was waning and obscured by thick clouds, barely illuminated the horizon. The height of the trees added to the darkness. Reaching the walls wasn't enough. They needed to make a hole in them, and all they had were pocket knives. Fortunately, the temple walls were made of brick and wood, which were relatively easy to penetrate. Once they removed one brick, the rest would come out easily. They began working quietly. The Parse on one side and Passepartout on the other started loosening the bricks to create a 2-foot wide opening. They were making good progress when suddenly a cry came from inside the temple, followed almost immediately by answering cries from outside. Passepartout and the guide stopped. Had they been heard? Was the alarm being raised? It was wise to withdraw, so they did, followed by Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis. They hid back in the woods and waited for the disturbance to settle, ready to continue their attempt as soon as things quieted down. Unfortunately, the guards then appeared at the rear of the temple and took positions to prevent any surprises. It was hard to describe how disappointed they felt after being interrupted. They couldn't reach the victim now, so how could they save her? Sir Francis shook his fists in frustration. Passepartout was beside himself with anger, and the guide was boiling with rage. The calm Fogg, however, remained composed and showed no signs of distress. "We have no choice but to leave," whispered Sir Francis. "Nothing else we can do but leave," echoed the guide. "Hold on," said Fogg. "I am not due in Allahabad until tomorrow before noon." "But what do you expect to do?" asked Sir Francis. "Daylight is only hours away, and the opportunity that seems lost now might come back at the last moment." Sir Francis wondered what Phileas Fogg was thinking. Was this calm Englishman planning to make a daring move at the last minute to save the young woman from being sacrificed? It would be completely foolish, and it was hard to believe that Fogg would be so naive. Still, Sir Francis agreed to stay and see this terrible situation through. The guide took them to the edge of the clearing where they could watch the sleeping groups. Meanwhile, Passepartout, who had climbed onto the lower branches of a tree, was considering an idea that had suddenly come to him and was now firmly stuck in his mind. He started by thinking, "This is crazy," but then thought, "Why not? It's a chance, maybe the only one, and with these drunk people." With that thought, he moved carefully down to the lowest branches, which bent almost to the ground. Hours passed, and the first light of dawn began to appear, though it was still dark. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The sleeping crowd stirred, tambourines began to sound, and songs and cries filled the air. The time for the sacrifice had arrived. The doors of the pagoda opened, and a bright light spilled out. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis saw the victim inside. She seemed to be trying to escape as she woke from her drugged state. Sir Francis's heart raced. Grabbing Mr. Fogg's hand, he found an open knife. Just then the crowd began to move. The young woman went unconscious from the fumes and was led among the fakirs who chanted and cried out during their rituals. Phileas Fogg and his companions blended into the back of the crowd and followed. Within 2 minutes they reached the stream and stopped 50 paces from the pyre, where the Rajah's body still lay. In the dim light they saw the victim, unconscious, lying next to her husband's body. A torch was brought, and the wood, soaked with oil, quickly caught fire. At that moment, Sir Francis and the guide grabbed Phileas Fogg, who was about to rush onto the pyre in a moment of reckless bravery. But Fogg quickly pushed them aside when the whole scene suddenly changed. A scream of terror went up, and the crowd fell to the ground terrified. The old Rajah, who was supposed to be dead, suddenly rose like a ghost, picked up his wife, and came down from the pyre amid the swirling smoke, which made him look even more like a ghost. Fakir soldiers and priests, struck with fear, lay with their faces to the ground, too scared to look up at this incredible sight. The woman, who was thought to be dead, was carried away effortlessly by the strong arms that held her. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis were amazed. The guide bowed his head, and Passepartout was just as shocked. The revived Rajah walked up to Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg and said sharply, "Let's go." It was Passepartout who had sneaked onto the pyre during the smoke and, taking advantage of the darkness, saved the young woman from death. Passepartout had boldly made his way through the crowd while everyone was in panic. Moments later, all four of them had vanished into the woods, and the elephant was carrying them away quickly. But they soon heard cries, noises, and a bullet whizzed past Phileas Fogg's hat, revealing that their escape had been discovered. The Rajah's body was now back on the burning pyre, and the priests, having recovered from their shock, realized that the rescue had happened. They rushed into the forest, followed by soldiers who fired shots at the escaping group. However, they quickly put more distance between themselves and their pursuers, and soon were out of range of the bullets and arrows. Chapter 14. Phileas Fogg travels the entire length of the beautiful Ganges Valley without ever bothering to notice it. The daring deed had been accomplished, and for an hour Passepartout couldn't stop laughing at his success. Sir Francis shook the good fellow's hand, and his master simply said, "Well done," high praise coming from him. Passepartout modestly insisted that all the credit belonged to Mr. Fogg. As for the young Indian woman, she had been unaware of everything that had happened, and was now resting peacefully in one of the howdahs, wrapped in a traveling blanket. Thanks to the Parsee's expert guidance, the elephant moved quickly through the still dark forest. An hour after leaving the pagoda, they had already crossed a vast plain. They stopped at 7 o'clock, with the young woman still in a state of complete exhaustion. The guide gave her a little brandy and water to drink, but she remained groggy and couldn't fully wake up. Sir Francis, knowing the effects of intoxication from drug fumes, reassured his companions about her condition. However, he was more concerned about her future. He told Phileas Fogg that if Aouda stayed in India, she would inevitably fall back into the hands of her executioners. These fanatics were spread across the country, and, despite the English police, would find her again in Madras, Bombay, or Calcutta. Her only safety would come from leaving India forever. They reached the station of Allahabad around 10 o'clock. With the railway line back in service, they would be able to reach Calcutta in less than 24 hours. This meant Phileas Fogg could still make it in time to catch the steamer leaving Calcutta the next day, on October 25th at noon, for Hong Kong. The young woman was settled in one of the station's waiting rooms, while Passepartout was tasked with buying her various toiletries, a dress, a shawl, and some furs, with unlimited credit from his master. Passepartout quickly set out into the streets of Allahabad, known as the City of God, one of the most revered cities in India, built at the meeting point of two sacred rivers, the Ganges and Jumna. As Passepartout shopped, he took some time to explore the city, once known for its strong fort, which is now a state prison. The city's trade has significantly declined. He looked around for a market like the ones he knew from Regent Street, but couldn't find anything similar. Finally, he found an older, grumpy Jewish man selling second-hand items. Passepartout bought a dress made of Scottish fabric, a large cloak, and a nice otter-skin coat, all for £75. Feeling proud of his purchases, he headed back to the station. Meanwhile, Aouda started to recover from the influence of the priest Pillaji. She gradually returned to herself, and her beautiful eyes regained their gentle Indian look. The train was about to leave Allahabad, and Mr. Fogg paid the guide exactly what they had agreed on, nothing more. This surprised Passepartout, who remembered how much his master owed to the guide's dedication. The guide had risked his life during the adventure at Pillaji, and if the Indians caught him later, it would be hard for him to escape their revenge. There was also the matter of what to do with the elephant Keone, which had been purchased at a high price, but Phileas Fogg had already made up his mind. "Parsee," he said to the guide, "you've been helpful and loyal. Would you like to keep this elephant? He's yours." The guide's eyes lit up. "You're giving me a fortune," he exclaimed. "Take him," Mr. Fogg replied, "and I'll still owe you." "That's great," said Passepartout. "Take him, my friend. Keone is a brave and faithful animal." He then approached the elephant and gave him several lumps of sugar, saying, "Here, Keone." Here you go." The elephant grunted with satisfaction and, wrapping his trunk around Passepartout's waist, lifted him up to his head. Passepartout, not scared at all, patted the animal, who gently set him back down on the ground. Shortly afterward, Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout, along with Aouda, who had the best seat, were speeding towards Benares in a carriage. The journey covered 80 miles and took just 2 hours. During the trip, the young woman fully regained her senses. She was amazed to find herself in this carriage on a railway, dressed in European clothes and surrounded by strangers. Her companions first gave her a bit of liquor to revive her, and then Sir Francis explained everything that had happened, highlighting Phileas Fogg's bravery in risking his life to save her, and Passepartout's bold idea had led to their success. Mr. Fogg stayed quiet, while Passepartout, feeling embarrassed, kept saying it wasn't worth talking about. Aouda thanked her rescuers with tears more than words. Her eyes expressed her gratitude more clearly than her words could. As she thought back to the sacrifice and the danger still facing her, she shuddered with fear. Phileas Fogg understood that Aouda was still worried, so he offered to take her to Hong Kong to keep her safe until everything calmed down. She gratefully accepted his offer. She mentioned that she had a Parsee relative who was a major merchant in Hong Kong, which, although on the Chinese coast, is currently under British control. At 12:30, the train arrived in Benares. This was where Sir Francis Cromarty was getting off because he needed to rejoin his troops stationed a few miles north of the city. He said goodbye to Phileas Fogg, wishing him well and hoping he would come back through the area in a less dramatic and more successful way. Mr. Fogg gave him a brief handshake. Aouda's goodbye was more heartfelt. Remembering her debt to Sir Francis and Passepartout, received a warm handshake from the general. After leaving Benares, the railway ran along the valley of the Ganges for a while. Through the carriage windows, the travelers glimpsed the varied landscape of Bihar, lush green mountains, fields of barley, wheat, and corn, jungles with green alligators, tidy villages, and dense leafy forests. As night fell, the train sped on, with the roar of tigers, bears, and wolves echoing as they fled from the locomotive. They arrived in Calcutta at 7 in the morning, and the ship to Hong Kong was scheduled to leave at noon, giving Phileas Fogg 5 hours of spare time. According to his schedule, he was supposed to arrive in Calcutta on October 25th, which was exactly when he got there. He wasn't late or early. The 2 days he had gained between London and Bombay were lost during the journey across India, but Phileas Fogg didn't seem to regret it.